I'm very, very pleased to be sitting virtually opposite Phil Okwedy. Phil Okwedy I've known for many years, since before he was a storyteller, although I suspect Phil has always been a storyteller of sorts. And I'm going to do something different. Usually what I ask is, what was the moment that you became a storyteller? But actually with Phil, what I'm going to do with you is go backwards. So
Okay.
tell us about your new show.
Okay, the new show, The Gods Are All Here, backwards is really interesting, actually. A really interesting way of doing it. So it was created originally with you, Michael, with using a stability grant from Arts Council Wales. So during that first lockdown, and we worked like this virtually and created the show together, or began creating the show together. And you were a questioner and provocateur. The only word we have for that is dramaturg, but we're not happy with it.
Not really.
It doesn't really fit, but that's how you helped me to shape the show. And then there was the opportunity to perform it live at Beyond the Border last year.
Where you got a standing ovation.
Thank you very much. I might not have mentioned that, but I did get a standing ovation. And then Adverse Camber came on board and got us funding so that we were able to spend, I think, 3 weeks, wasn't it, in the spring, in 4-day sections, actually working physically on the show in Llanelli. And now it's on tour. And the heart of this show, I probably should mention, are these letters that I'd found in my mother's flat after she died. I didn't grow up with either of my parents, but I knew my mother. So when she died, I was clearing out her flat, and there were these letters written from my father to her. And that is the heart of the show. And I kind of look at those letters to see if I can find the parents I never had in them.
It's a fascinating journey. I mean, I've heard you tell the story in various forms for over 2 years now, I think.
Yes.
And I never tire of it. And also because it's storytelling, every time you do it, it's different. The same things happen to the same people in the same order, but it's also completely nuanced. And just for me, getting into the room after being in lockdown for so long, although there was actually a bit of a COVID backlash, wasn't there? Because we both went to Belgium to go and work at a festival there, which was fantastic. Except we went all the way there together, and then the next morning, Phil rang me and said, "Oh, I just tested positive for COVID."
Yes, so I came straight home. And you managed to stay for the 3 days, but only to discover that I had given you COVID.
Yeah, cheers, Phil. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, those days weirdly seem like a long, long time ago. And what's very present in my memory is what happened when we got into the theatre space in Furness in Llanelli, with an amazing team. Moller was there making an incredible backdrop. Mm-hmm. The tech team were fantastic. The lighting was amazing. And I don't know about you, but suddenly I kind of felt, okay, it's a show now.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, one of the things that I remember are all these little things that we brought that we thought were so precious. So for instance, online, because I'm next to the camera, I could sit and you could see the letters, and it was that intimate. And I could show you postcards. I could show you things, which of course doesn't really work on stage. And for a long time, I think the whole of that first week, we were grappling with how we might do this live with projection and things like that. But as we were working physically, those kind of things fell away, and particularly because I think we all came to the realization that because these letters are the center of the show, and it's storytelling, it's analog. This is an analog world. And the digital suddenly felt very uncomfortable and unnecessary. And from that, I think when I had the postcards, we went away from the digital, but then I began describing them in sort of detail, because still clinging on to that idea of when it had been on Zoom, essentially. But you just realize slowly that none of that is necessary. It's a completely different beast, different animal.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I remember you first started to use the big pictures beyond the border, and that experiment really worked. And then when we were in, was it in Plymouth? Or
Exeter.
Exeter. You used a projection.
Yes.
And that was very interesting. But again, it gave it a totally different feel. It was out with the world of the stage. And somehow it wasn't part of the performance in a way that the set that you have now is absolutely the environment of the story. And in terms, because it's been a pretty long journey from there to here. And Phil, I'd just like to invite you to reflect on something that was, to begin with, an absolute keystone for you, but then got dumped. And I'm thinking about the great Kate Tempest poem, which you had to have at one stage.
Yes. What's it called? It's called, what is it called?
I don't know.
Just gone from me. It's John, the brand new, the poem. Yes, Michael. The poem is The Brand New Ancients by Kate Tempest, or Kai Tempest, I should say. And in that poem, there is a section that very specifically talks about us humans as being gods. And this really sparked something for me. And so in the first several iterations, Zoom iterations of the show, I actually read, because I couldn't learn it. I don't know why I couldn't learn it, but I wasn't able to learn it. But I read this section. But by the time we'd done it twice, it kind of became obvious that we didn't need it. But by that time, I had been back and forth with Kai Tempest's agents and publishers in order to get the rights to be able to use this. And I'd finally been able to negotiate them to £400 for a year's use. And it seems very strange, the amount of effort that I put into to hold on to that. But actually, thinking about it, part of the reason was those iterations over Zoom, because we invited peers and other people working within our section of the industry, and invited feedback. And several people fed back that although it was wonderful, they kind of thought maybe it was unnecessary. And that definitely fed into it. And I began to feel that I could do it myself, I guess.
There's something about that. I think the bridge that you need to get to where you need to be, you can happily burn behind you if it does its job. And sometimes we clutter ourselves up creatively with stuff that we don't actually need, but we can't jettison.
Yeah, I think that's like the first telling of anything, isn't it? It's more like a roadmap. You need all the waypoints. Yes, you need all those to take you through, but the more that you play and the more that you develop, the more you realize actually you don't need this thing. I think it was I was having a conversation with Daniel Morden one day, and he's described it as you have all these words and then suddenly you realize you can do this thing with just a gesture. But you have to get to the place where you can be confident doing that. Whether experience kind of circumnavigates that, I don't know, because the material's always new, isn't it? So you're always finding the story.
I think that what you just said there should be written in very large letters on the side of a building somewhere.
Which part?
The thing you just said. Well, because
finding. You're always finding the story.
That's that. You're always finding the story.
Yes, and if you get to the point and you're not finding the story, maybe you should leave off telling it for a while. Exactly. Because otherwise it isn't fresh. Then it's going to start to get into that recitation thing, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah. And also you have to have a reason to step on that stage.
Yes.
You're talking to real people in real time. It's not a play. It's
No.
the storyteller telling the people who have come to hear the story, and the storyteller needs to have the oomph and the desire to tell it, or it won't work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you have to, it's a very strange and wonderful thing because, you know, as the teller, you are there yourself as the person telling the story, and also you're doing your best not to get in the way of that story.
Which I think is it's definitely a more complex job for the shows that you've been doing, because you're in the show. You are not only telling the story, but you're a character in the story.
Yes. And that was a thing that we worked on a lot, both digitally, Zoom, and also when we were working physically together, a lot on that element. And yeah, and doing that and yet not doing it. So although I'm there, I'm not, I have to do it in such a way as not to tell the audience what to think.
Yeah.
Even though I'm there offering myself, but it can't be that I'm pre-warning them,
Exactly.
you know, pre-preparing them for things. They have to be able to find the story.
Exactly. I'm aware we're talking about it in a way because we know about what we're talking right now, but actually people listening might not. So maybe Phil, you should we can step back a bit and actually talk about what the show is and what it came from and all the rest. It's called The Gods Are All Here. I've seen it, I don't know how many times. I love it. It gets better every time. But could you give our lovely listeners a bit of background about what it's all about, where it came from, and what's in the show?
So I'd found these letters from my father, sorry, to my mother. And when I found them, I didn't know what to do with them, so I just brought them home. And that was before I was a storyteller. So in the interim, I became a storyteller. And eventually, after many years, I thought about these letters and thought that actually the thing that they wanted, was for them to be a story. So I began to think about how I might turn it into a story, and that actually involved a lot of free writing, a lot of what were these letters to me, what did I want to do with them, what kind of things did I want to say. Sometimes that free writing would be, I mean, it would just be a lot of swearing and blah, blah, in order, but it's I don't know if you've ever done free writing, and listeners too, but if you're trying to get to the kernel of something, it's sort of miraculous, because something will happen. And through that process, I began to think about the letters, but my own experience, what was happening to me when these letters were being written. They cover about 13 years in total, so just before I was born till I'm nearly 12. And so I began writing and thinking about my experiences. And of course, I'm a storyteller, so I knew that they were that I wanted folktale and myth woven into this. And I think I'd come across one story that I didn't know how to tell, that is now in the show, that found a place in the show. And I've had that experience before, actually, with another show that I carried a story around for about 3 years, never having told it, knowing I wanted to, but how, where, when. So yes, one of the folktales was already there, but I also knew I needed to. There was something about myth. I in my blurb, in my bio, I'll call myself a myth maker, but that element comes from really when I first came to tell stories. I didn't feel like there was any tradition or any stories that I could tell. I really felt like an outsider to everything. Subsequently, I decided I can tell nearly any stories if they speak to me, and I acknowledge them, and I don't put on the clothes of the culture that they come from, pretend to be something I'm not. But I came to this point where I wanted to tell myth. And now that is culturally, somehow you need to be able to approach myth in order to tell it. And I just couldn't. I'd had the experience of hearing lots of other tellers tell myth, including 12 fantastic tellers, and you were one of those in Aberystwyth, telling the Mabinogion, the whole of the Mabinogion in a day. And I really enjoyed it, but it didn't speak to me. Mm. And so I began to think about how I could perhaps create my own myth with my own family history and stories that spoke to me. And I'd already done a little bit of that with another show called Stick Fighting Warriors. So I kind of knew that's what I was going to do when I came to The Gods Are All Here. And then I began just researching, reading about Nigeria and Igbo culture. My father was Igbo from Southeast Nigeria. And I came across this fragment of myth about a lake called Oguta Lake. And into Oguta Lake, they run two rivers. And I think they're green and brown, actually, in reality, but they don't mix. They never mix. So if you go, you can see this sort of dividing line between these two rivers in the lake. And the fragment of myth is that these two rivers were married, were deities of some sort and married, and they'd had an argument. And that's it. And I looked, I researched, and there's no further explanation or story about that. But I began to think about the time when they would have not been split before the argument that had split them. And so I started this story, The Gods Are All Here, in a time where there is a lake, and the lake is complete and whole. And during the story, the lake, which is green, is split into its two constituent parts, which in the story are yellow and blue. And the mythic element of the story then is the search to make the lake whole again. So it has a kind of environmental, well, it has a large environmental theme, which we've never talked about, I don't think, particularly.
No, actually.
But it's there.
Yes.
There, it sits there. And then, oh yeah, and then we came across, I came across the idea of the Osu, which is a caste amongst the Igbo, which is a kind of untouchable caste. And I was outraged by that idea. And so I think in the first iteration, there is an old woman in this mythic element, this mythic folktale story. And I think she was an outcast. She was an Osu to start with. And there was lots of historical detail, I think, in that. And again, that's one of the things that faded away, that slipped away.
But there's something interesting about things finding their way into a story, because I remember the Osu, when we talked about that, it was highly charged, and it gave loads of oomph to the story, and it made it matter. And then later on, the story got stronger, and actually the historical stuff became less important. In fact, it became an intrusion because it was too interesting. Yeah. It was suddenly not on the wavelength of the story. So it's still fascinating and still interesting and something that people should know about. But within the story, it served its purpose and then sidled off.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to, because there's something about the material that you're working with, the mythological material you're working with, which is different to, for example, folk tale material or wonder tale material. And a lot of, for example, Advis Camber, who's producing your show right now, their bigger shows all seem to be about myth. And I just wanted to ask you about your reflections on why is myth, which is something that we've consigned to the dustbin in many ways, why is myth having a resurgence?
I think it talks about those elemental human psychological, psychic experiences. Yeah, the gods are playing out our inner lives in many ways, I think. Whereas the folk tales is prosaic the right word?
Maybe, yeah.
It's just because they're small. I mean, they're just as powerful and they're just as loaded with wisdom over time. And but there's something that's very clear, I think, in the mythic elements. Part of the thing about Oguta Lake that I was researching and came across was there's a Mami Wata cult around the lake too. And then Mami Wata began to kind of emerge into this story. And quite a few years ago, for a different project, maybe for the Stick Fighters project, I had gone to the British Library and read some folk tales. And one of which was the Crocodile Woman, another Igbo story in which a hunter is out hunting one day and he sees this huge crocodile coming out of a river, and it shakes off its skin, and there's a woman, and it's a bit in the mode of a Selkie story. In that he steals the skin, but then he's talked back into giving the skin back, and then he's swallowed.
Okay.
and he's taken back to the crocodile woman's home, and he thinks he's going to be eaten, but he's not eaten. He's treated very well, and then he's released. And he's released with the gift of being able to understand the animals talking.
Great. Handy.
And he on, of course, the proviso that he never tells anybody.
Oh.
Yeah. And then one day the chickens are talking and his wife is nagging him, and he lets everything go and he drops down dead. And that's the end of it. And that's another story I quite like, but I haven't told ever as the story. But that part with the crocodile woman and a Mami Wata figure coming out of the lake as a crocodile, as something. And now I think maybe I did find a reference once that Mami Wata could be a crocodile, but often she is a woman. But I felt, this is my myth, so I felt all right about taking that and using that image.
Now, Phil, it's great to see you on tour, and this is your second fairly big show. There's another one to come. Am I allowed to say that, or is that secrets?
No, you're definitely like another one to come. There is so part of my own experience, talking about my own experiences, I was fostered, and so in the show I talk about my foster mother, Auntie Barbara, and it's very clear to me in the show, and I think to other people, that this is a missing element. The show is long enough and big enough that there's no way of fitting Auntie Barbara more into it. But I definitely have a project in mind of a show about Auntie Barbara, in the vein of I don't know if people will know Hugh Lupton's Jenny Wing show, because that is, I spoke to him recently and he said it was a praise poem. And I have praise songs in my mind, and certainly in West Africa, in praise songs, the person that the song is about, they are evoked. Their spirit is actually evoked. So it's a very loose idea, but this idea that show will evoke Auntie Barbara.
Just for people who don't know, Hugh Lupton is one of the founders, I suppose, of the UK storytelling revival. And he's based in the east of England, in Norfolk, I think.
I think it's Norfolk, yeah.
And he's very, very rooted where he lives. And he has a massive repertoire. And he did this Jenny Wing story, Sounds from the Horse's Mouth, in the second person. Because Jenny Wing was a woman who looked after Hugh when he was younger, when he was a kid. And when Jenny Wing died, Hugh went to her funeral, and there was a eulogy to her from someone from a priest who had never even met her. And I hope you won't mind me. Well, he does it in the story, so of course you know, he tells everyone when he's doing the show. So I think I can say this. He says, "Well, I've got to do this. I've got to make the eulogy," and he did. And it's, for me, it was an absolute tipping point in what I saw that stories could do, because it was not a patchwork as such, but there were lots of different bits of material. There was first person stuff, there was Johnny Wing's life and adventures and other stories, and it was just woven together in the most beautiful way. And he had Chris Wood on the fiddle as well, so it was for me, that show was a massive eye-opener. And it's interesting to know that it's also had an influence on you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I never saw it. I was given to it as on a CD. But actually, in response, when I was talking about and thinking about doing stick fighters, and somebody gave me that just because of the way I was talking about my dad. Yeah, it definitely has had a massive influence. And one of the things I didn't think about, I did know, but I haven't thought about it before, was the eulogy. Because actually, I've now I'm older, I've been asked, and I've given several for people that I knew, but not for Auntie Barbara. And that her eulogy was very much along those lines of by somebody who just did not know her. And so, you know, I'm just busy scribbling that down as a note to self now.
Great. Now, Phil, you weren't always a storyteller, were you?
No, I wasn't always a storyteller. I was a school teacher. And when I first came to storyteller, first met you, actually, Michael, I was a storyteller because you came into the school to teach us, the teachers, how to share a story. So some beginner storytelling skills, so we could share stories with our classes in order to raise their attainment in writing. Because we'd identified that they had no stories in their heads. So whenever they were writing and we were asking them to write, all their energy would go on what's happening next, which I always describe as I can see the page before me of a child's writing. It's about half a page. It's an hour's worth, but it's about half a page. And it's equivalent of me and Johnny ran down the street, and then this alien aircraft, this alien spaceship came out of the air, and it landed, and the aliens came out, and in capital letters and lots of exclamation marks, bang, bang, bang. And of course, you know, I was asking them to think about their vocabulary choices and sentence patterns, and they had no energy at all. So we learned to tell stories, and it worked because now they had the story in their head. One of the things that you did, which was extraordinary, because I had come across storytelling before, and it was a Pike Orbit storytelling, and I'm not sure whether that was his intention or not, but he did an inset day, and our school was huge, so there were 100 people in the inset, and we told stories, but we told stories in big groups, so that we ended up reciting them together. And then when we tried to use that storytelling, that's what we did as a school. We videoed our kids all telling a story together. So they had no ownership. Whereas with you, the emphasis was on giving them ownership. So once we shared the story, we turned it over to them for them to find their own words. And as you said at the beginning, you know, 90% of storytelling or 85% of storytelling is the same. So they would take whatever we told them as teachers, but of course their own nuance, their own vocabulary, their own mind's eye applied to it. So they had ownership, and it worked. But I really loved storytelling. I really enjoyed the storytelling. I enjoyed the writing less. Or at least the teaching of the writing, the teaching part of it. But I really enjoyed it, and so I pursued it further. And I ended up coming on a course with you, and feel like I got lucky, really. Was in the right place at the right time, and so opportunities came through that, and here we are.
Indeed. Phil, actually, I've got a question for you, because I think there's a moment in a lot of people's creative lives when things are never the same again. So I'm very clear about the moment I became a storyteller. And it's before I told my first story. I went to the first Beyond the Border, and I saw something that completely blew my mind, and I walked out of the tent knowing that's what I had to do. Was there a discrete moment when you something in your brain went, that's it?
That's a really interesting. That's a really interesting question. Trying to find that moment. I think probably it was more. There were several moments. No, that's not true. Actually, there was a decision made, and the decision was on your course. Actually,
Right.
I came to your course at Bleddfa, which is, I think it's 5 days, isn't it?
Yeah.
Something like that. And you did a thing the first day we were there, and you asked us to just remember an anecdote. And my brain is already befuddled, and I can't think of anything. And there are, I don't know, 16 or 17 people sitting in a circle. And after you've given it a few minutes, you said, I can see a few people have already got their anecdote. If you've already got it, just look around the circle because you'll see when it comes on somebody. So that's just more pressure.
Sorry about that.
I can't think of anything, and I really hated it. And then that night we were camping out in the orchard in Bleddfa, and I seriously considered whether I was going to get in the car and go. And I thought, well, I've paid for this week. I have to stay. And the next day wasn't much better.
Sorry.
Because that's where the idea of cultural appropriation came up.
Yeah.
So I was enjoying the day. I was enjoying this workshop, and then suddenly this idea that, could I tell any of these stories? I felt completely hamstrung. So again, in the orchard that night, I was thinking, shall I leave? I'll just leave. But I didn't. And you have invited storytellers. So the third morning, the invited storyteller was Christine McMahon.
Yeah, Christine, she's great.
And she just talked about this thing of storytellers needing big balls, really. That was her phrase, and I don't know what it was about it. It wasn't that I thought that I had them, but there was something about the way that she approached storytelling. And suddenly, I was telling a story with 3 others, and I think it was a story, again, it was anecdotal stories, and we just had 3 separate ones, and we had to put them together and make a little story out of it and present it. And I can't remember exactly what I did, but somebody laughed. And that was it. Sorry it took a long time to get there, but that was the moment. Somebody laughed.
Can you remember what it was you said?
I can't remember what it was. I thought it was ridiculous. I think I was just, I think I was probably being quite physical. That's probably why I can't remember what it was. I think it had something to do with drinking. It seemed to have something to do with drinking. And maybe I just fell on the floor and people laughed. I can't remember. But there was that moment that I thought, I want to do this. I want to do this. This is it. This is the thing that I want to do. And then I spent the rest of the week. The end of your course is everybody gets the opportunity to stand up and tell, not to those just on the course, but to an invited audience. So I guess there were about 30 people. And I was terrified. But having done it and the story went down well, and I knew that to continue, I needed to do that again soon. If I left it too long, the mountain would be as steep again. And you invited all of us, I think, to come to Milgy's in Cardiff.
That's right.
So I came to Milgy's on a very, very hot August night.
Okay, sorry, Phil, I'm going to interrupt just because Milgy's doesn't exist anymore.
No.
So Milgy's was a fantastic little venue. It was a vegetarian cafe in Cardiff, and it had a yurt. Weirdly, the yurt was slightly bigger than the space available for it. It was really crammed in there. And you could maybe get 30 people max in there. And it was a regular, was it weekly or monthly, I think?
Monthly.
It was a monthly get-together of storytelling. And all the usual suspects were there, plus people you'd never seen before. It was absolutely fantastic. A hat was sent around, Gito Davis's hat. And it turned, if you went to do a gig in Milgy's, if you came away with a couple of quid, you counted yourself lucky. But it kind of didn't matter because it was a kind of storytelling petri dish, really.
Yeah.
Loads of people took their first steps there, and you did. Was about who is the true.
No, I did the story that's known as the Cowtail Switch.
Ah, that's right. Yeah.
And again, it's, you know, the entry. This was I was searching for a story to tell. Bled for it and hamstrung. I can't tell any stories, and I'd read the story 2 days before, and because the story, and I reread it and had a chief in it. When I finally went to meet my father in Nigeria, I discovered he was a chief. And that was the thing that allowed me to tell the Cowtail Switch. By this time, my father was also dead.
Mm.
So for people who know that story, I'm not going to actually do a spoiler, but it would sort of make sense. That was also part of my feeling that I could tell that story. But the Milgies thing was it was really busy. I had to sit outside. They pulled up the sides of the tent. I went in. I can remember telling it, and I can remember it going down well, but I can also remember very much feeling like the story was a shield to protect me from all those people, because I was terrified. But I was very lucky because David Ambrose was there, who was then director of Beyond the Border, and they were just beginning a project with 4 other international storytelling festivals. So with mentors, you were one of the mentors for your Beyond the Border, and student tellers from the various countries. So there was Beyond the Border, there was a festival from Sweden, Italy, Poland, and Greece.
Yeah.
And David asked me if I'd like to be one of the students. And because I was a teacher, there was no way I could do Poland or Italy because they were in the autumn. But I managed to join the next early summer, I think. So I went to Sweden and Greece, and of course Beyond the Border itself. I think it was 2014 then. And I mean, that was amazing because there were all these mentor tellers. But there were, I mean, I think Beyond the Border probably had the smallest contingent of students. I mean, the Italy contingent, they seemed to come with like 20 students every time, and they always changed. It was different students every time. It was amazing. You got to hear so many tellers, so many different ways of telling, think about so many things. It was absolutely, it was a wonderful, I mean, I wouldn't call it an apprenticeship because I was still apprenticed after it, but it was absolutely fantastic. So I think I've been very lucky. And during that period, I was teaching in the day. I think Milgies was on a Tuesday. And I would jump in my car and drive up from Pembroke Dock to Milgies on a Tuesday once a month just to hear tellers, because there weren't any. There was no other way of hearing them. And sometimes that would be to be invited. I would tell a 10-minute tale. But sometimes I would just go just to listen to people tell.
And that's a 2.5-hour journey, isn't it?
That's a 2, yeah. So that's when I say, you know, yes, this was the moment. This is what I'm going to do, definitely. But then again, I was lucky because then Beyond the Border got some seed money for storytelling clubs. So for a year, I ran a storytelling cafe in Tenby and was able to invite people and pay them, Michael. I was able to invite people and pay them £150 for coming and doing an evening. It was amazing. Obviously, that didn't last. And then we got to the door money. And for the next 2.5, 3 years, it was still very good. But towards the end, the audience fell away. And I remember a teller coming down one night on a Friday. They'd been in a school in the valleys all day. They came and told, and then they drove home. Oof. And I'm not even going to say what the door money was. It was, you know, I just realized it couldn't go on. You can't ask people to do that. Although storytellers will travel for peanuts a lot of the time.
Phil, I mean, it's so interesting hearing you talk about your shows. So you've actually effectively got a trilogy. You've done 2. The one's on the road right now, and then there's this proposed Auntie Barbara show.
Yeah.
And I think everyone who comes to see The Gods Are All Here loves Auntie Barbara.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks she's fantastic. She is everyone's hero, I think, who comes to see the show. But there's also, apart from this, the show side of what you do, you're also involved with an organization called People Speak Up in Llanelli. And I was wondering if how you see those two things in relationship. Are they things you keep separate, or is there some connection between the two things?
There is some connection. I was fortunate enough in People Speak Up in partnership with Beyond the Border, and Beyond the Border's mycelium hubs. So I was fortunate enough to be an associate storyteller with People Speak Up. And I'd already previously been doing some work with them. And through that, as a community storyteller, I've worked with lots of organizations and are always looking for opportunities to do community storytelling or applied storytelling. So actually, directly through that, I'm just in discussion presently with Foster Wales, with the Pembrokeshire branch of Foster Wales, in order to do some workshops with storytelling with foster carers and foster children. So that's a kind of direct thing that comes from Auntie Barbara, really. So, and that's briefly mentioned really in the show, but it's funny when it's your own life, you know. So I briefly mention it, but it obviously it stays with people.
Absolutely fascinating conversation, Phil. I mean, the time has absolutely flown by. If there was one thing you were going to pick out of the things that we've talked about for someone who was thinking about becoming a storyteller or starting to tell stories, what would it be?
Listen. Whether it's, you know, podcasts, CDs, listen to stories, find ways to listen to stories. And it's a bit of advice I can give myself, because I still don't think I'm a great listener. And it's so key. I mean, without listeners, we're nothing. Oh, we're storytellers or nothing. We're crazy people in a room talking to ourselves. But also what you learn from just listening. So yeah, I think that would be my advice. Listen as much as you can, and of course then seek out opportunities to tell, because storytelling is very much a process. And I think we began this conversation talking about how we've worked together on the show and how it's always different, and it's still a process. It's an ongoing process. It's not a process I expect to ever finish, unless, you know, something miraculous happens and I tour the show consistently for 5 nights a week for 4 years, which isn't going to happen. I'll never have the opportunity to tell it enough, because something's always changing.
Yeah, it's always work in progress.
Yeah. And sometimes that's something I bring and I know I'm going to try, and sometimes it happens in the process.
And I think it's something that we don't perhaps talk about enough, is that the show that you see will not necessarily be the same show that you see tomorrow.
No.
Whereas in a scripted piece, it's utterly, oh yeah, there are changes and differences and so on from night to night, but basically you have a script. And I think the thing that a lot of non-storytelling folk don't quite clock is that there is no script.
No, there is no script. I have a book with some drawings in it. That's kind of, I never, you know, I didn't write the show at all. It's my terrible story maps.
Well, it seems to do the job. People like it. So, Phil Okwedy, thank you so much for that chat. It's absolutely fascinating, interesting to hear your journey, and good luck with the tour. And I'll put some information, I'll put your website and I'll put the gig list for the show into the program notes so people can catch up with you and find out what you're up to. Phil Okwedy, thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a delight.